Hello everyone, and welcome to this free introductory class, which will introduce you to some of the key ideas involved in applying the ideas and theory of Jungian psychology to actual on-the-ground depth psychology work. This class is the introductory module to our full course, Jung 102, Applied Jungian Psychology. So this course will introduce you to some of the innovative techniques developed by Carl Jung for working with his clients and also for doing his own personal work. And we'll see why that's important as we go along for everyone, not just for Jung. So what we're going to do in this module is to look at the difference between theory and application in general. We'll look at what we're trying to achieve through the application of Jungian techniques. We're not just randomly using these techniques. We have a goal in mind. And we'll also look at Jung's approach to achieving these goals, his specific step-by-step things. We won't cover, of course, all of that in this class, although we'll cover much of it in the subsequent modules of the course. And we're going to close this class with a brief overview of what that course will entail, the content of the upcoming 8-module course, Jung 102, Applied Jungian Psychology. So this course is essentially a follow-up course, or a part 2, we might say, to our course Jung 101, Introduction to Jungian Psychology. Jung 101 is a foundational course, as is this course, and it provides an in-depth outline of the key concepts, terms, and dynamic processes of analytical psychology. Analytical psychology being the name that C.G. Jung gave to his theory. So although you're not required to take Jung 101 prior to taking this course, that is not a prerequisite to this course. However, it is recommended. It'll be helpful. In this course, we'll review some of the terms and ideas that we discussed in Jung 101. However, we will not go into these ideas in the kind of depth and detail that we did in the course Jung 101. So it'll be helpful to anyone taking this course to have some familiarity with Jung's psychology and with the terms that he used. As I said, we'll review some of those, but not all of them. Now, if you're interested in taking this course and don't want to take Jung 101, and maybe you're still a little vague on some of Jung's ideas, a good way to brush up on Jung's psychology and on these terms and on these basic concepts will be to read the textbook that we used in Jung 101, which is Murray Stein's, Jungian analyst Murray Stein's book, Jung's Map of the Soul. It's an excellent book, and it will help you to follow this course much more readily without having to stop and look things up, etc. So, both of these courses, Jung 101 and Jung 102, as I've said, are foundational courses in our certification program. In other words, they're everything that we do after this in the program that proceeds, that is subsequent to these classes. Everything is going to be based on these basic terms and these basic ideas of applying those core theoretical ideas. The main difference between these two courses, Jung 101 and Jung 102, is that Jung 101 is primarily a course on Jung's theory, while Jung 102 is primarily a survey course on how Jung applied his theory. In other words, there's a lot of different ways he applied it. We're going to touch on elements of each of those things, and many of these subsequent courses go into great depth on each of these applied aspects of his work. Now, all of this is going to be useful, but without some background, without some general understanding of the basic terms, it's easy to get lost. So if you're not familiar with those things, some kind of review of basic theory will be good for you, will be helpful for you, and also just, take it slow, step at a time. As I've said before, Jung's theory is not really that difficult, and much of his theory and many of his ideas have already been absorbed into culture. He started way back at the turn of the 20th century, the early parts of the 1900s, and he was very radical and way ahead of his time at that time, and a lot of that has been picked up by other psychologists, usually without referencing him, unfortunately. However, his ideas have seeped into culture, so some of these ideas you may know, but they've also been changed in ways in which sometimes Jung would applaud, other times Jung would have been appalled by. So we're going to try and stick to Jung's core ideas, and then as you absorb those core ideas, you can go with them where you like. If you like some of these innovations, you can follow them where they may lead you. So, as I say, Jung 102 is primarily a survey course of this theory. Now, in anthropology and linguistics, they use the terms synchronic and diachronic to describe different ways of studying a variety of phenomena. Now, the word synchronic refers to looking at things from the point of view of a particular point in time. It's like you slice open the ongoing of time and you just look at how things are in that moment. The word diachronic, on the other hand, refers to looking at things as they move and develop through times as they process. So why do you need to know that? You don't need to know that. But what I want to say is that Jung 101 was essentially what we would call a synchronic look at Jung's theory, while Jung 102, this course that this is an introductory lecture for, is a diachronic look at Jung's theory. That is to say, this course, Jung 102, is about process. It looks in depth at how Jung worked with his patients in his consulting room, as well as how he approached his own inner psychological work on himself. So it's about ongoing, through time, developing these theories, integrating these theories into an ongoing process in one's life. Again, the reason we just focus so much on theory in Jung 101 is because while it's not difficult, it's complex. There are a lot of moving parts in Jung's theory. Each little part is easy to absorb usually, but when you try to get them all at once, it can be a little overwhelming. So we take things a little bit at a time, tease them out, and hopefully that makes it a little bit easier. So interestingly, although Jung developed an innovative and dynamic theory of psychology, as we covered in depth in Jung 101, when actually working with people, interpreting dreams, encouraging them to do active imagination work, etc., he actually said that it was important to set theory aside, to forget theory. At one point, he even said that theory is the very devil. This is largely because of the importance that Jung gave to the unconscious itself. If we rely too much on theory, we have a tendency to not be paying close enough attention to the unconscious. And that is not to say that he undervalued consciousness, but rather that he felt he lived in a time when people had developed consciousness to such an extent that they had undervalued and ignored the unconscious. In Jung's view, human culture has reached a point where it has become impossible for consciousness to develop any further without integrating the unconscious. In other words, the way forward lies in paying more attention to that which has been neglected. That is, paying more attention to the unconscious. So he always gave primacy to the unconscious in his work, although he approached that work with a great deal of focused consciousness. So it's not unconscious at the expense of the consciousness, it's bringing consciousness to bear and into relationship with the unconscious. So what has this to do with Jung saying that theory is the very devil? As I say, Jung felt that if theory was pressed too far, if theory was concentrated on too much, then we run the danger that theory will actually repress the unconscious further, rather than allowing the unconscious to speak to us, to speak for itself, and for the unconscious to emerge naturally. This is what we want. We want the unconscious to emerge naturally, not unchecked, not without consciousness in dialogue and measuring and making moral, as we'll see, moral judgments about whether we should follow the unconscious in this particular direction or not. But we have a tendency in our culture now, and certainly back 100 years ago when Jung was starting out, we have a tendency to just say, what does the unconscious know, and just go ahead with our conscious plans, often very much to our detriment. So as we'll see throughout this course, all of Jung's approaches to working with people in analysis involve encouraging people to dialogue with the unconscious, to develop this relationship with the unconscious. Jung encouraged his patients to maintain a strong conscious stance in relation to the unconscious, while at the same time he encouraged them to listen to the unconscious, to encourage the unconscious to speak, and to then negotiate with the unconscious in such a way that the unconscious is respected and integrated into our conscious deliberations and into our daily lives. So what does, I keep saying the work we do, what does this work entail? Well, that's what the whole course is about. So naturally there are many aspects to the work and to how the work might actually take place. There, I hesitate to say infinite, but almost infinite varieties. And one of the reasons for this is that it's about finding out, not deciding who the individual is, but finding out, letting the unconscious tell us or tell our client who this individual is, and allowing ourselves and allowing the client to be that individual person in a way that fits naturally and hopefully in a life-affirming way fits into the social group, fits into the culture, and helps the culture to thrive, helps the family and the community and the culture at large to thrive. So how does the work take place? First, we need to decide what kind of work we're going to do. Will this be doing self-analysis? Will I work alone and just do my own inner work in the evenings or whatever when I have time to put some time aside to do some inner work? Will I be working with a therapist? Will I be doing work in a group? Will we be working with a 12-step group? All of these and many more approaches are valid to doing the work depending on who we are, and where any individual is in their own process. Once we've decided what kind of work we're going to do, there needs to be a specific boundarized space for this work to take place. This could be a therapist's office. It could be a quiet place in our own home. It could be a 12-step meeting place, etc. It's, as we say, there's many, many possibilities. Then there's, what do we do in this space? There's the actual step-by-step work that we do in the space that we allot for the work to take place. For Jung, this work, especially the second phase of this work, and we'll get into exactly what I mean by the second phase, always this work involves two basic categories, either dream work or active imagination, and these sometimes are combined in a variety of ways, as we'll see. So, however, these two categories can be subdivided into many different approaches and many different ways of working. Whether Jung was working with dreams or with active imagination, the work itself, the sort of the core, or certainly a first step of the work is always to identify dynamic symbols that emerge from the unconscious. What are the dynamic symbols that are appearing in my fantasy work, in my active imagination work, whatever that may entail, and we'll see that can be a great variety of methods can be applied to active imagination. And in my dreams, what are the images, the dominant images that arise from these dreams? So we study our dreams, the dreams of our clients, and we study the results of the active imagination work, and we try to identify dynamic symbols that emerge from the unconscious in these processes. Okay, so we do that, so then what? Why do that? Why bother? And what comes next? How do we understand and interpret these symbols? That's going to be the next big question. Symbols very often are, as I say, multivalent. They have many, many meanings, many possible interpretations. How do we approach that? Well, this question brings us to what is essentially the heart and soul of Jungian psychological work, and what much of this course and some of the subsequent courses, many of the subsequent courses in this program are going to deal with. Jung's theory claims that the central nervous system of all human beings generates patterns of energy that Jung called archetypes of the collective unconscious. These patterns emerge in the form of symbols. The symbols are not the archetypes themselves, although we often say, we often refer to them that way, even Jung referred to them that way, but when we get to the technical definition, the symbol is not the archetype, but it's a representation that the unconscious uses to communicate archetypal energies. So these patterns that Jung identified emerge in the form of symbols in our dream work, in our fantasy work, or our active imagination work. Because these patterns are common to all human beings, they can be discerned in cultural patterns. They have been deposited in cultural artifacts. And what I mean by cultural artifacts are things such as myths, fairy tales, religious forms, and you may know Jung spent a lot of time also discerning and studying the symbols that emerged in alchemy, Western, particularly all alchemy around the world, but particularly Western alchemy. So we discussed archetypes and the collective unconscious in quite a lot of detail in Jung 101. However, when doing so, we only touched on how Jung related them to myths, fairy tales, religious forms, alchemy, etc. In this course, we will spend much more time on exactly how Jung used these cultural artifacts in order to understand and interpret the symbols that emerged from the unconscious, from his own unconscious, from the unconscious of his clients and the people he worked with. And in a broader sense, he also used them to understand culture, contemporary culture, his contemporary culture, and where culture is moving now. And we'll look, as we go through the course, in all of these different, or many of these different manifestations of the meaning of symbols. Now, Jung's method, so this is an element of a particular method that Jung used. Sigmund Freud, who Jung worked with early in his career, used a technique when interpreting dreams and working with clients. He used a technique called free association. He used this technique when interpreting dreams and when working in his consulting room. Jung also used this technique. He valued this technique to a certain extent and used it throughout his life. However, Jung was aware that, in general, free association tends to lead the client farther and farther away from the central symbols of the dream. Jung was absolutely invested in focusing on the symbols, not only because they were of interest in communicating meaning, but they carried a type of energy that he called numinous, a charged numinosity, which meant that a lot of life energy was trapped in these symbols, and understanding the symbols and how they operated in the psyche of an individual could help to free up that energy and make it available to the person in their work. So free association did not focus on the symbols. Free association often would be, oh, this reminds me of this, and that reminds me of that. Now, those of you who are familiar with working in theory, therapy, and those of you who are familiar with Freud's work will know that he talked about defense mechanisms. Projection is a defense mechanism. Various forms of repression are defense mechanisms, and this can be a defense mechanism, which means there's the reason something is unconscious is because it makes me uncomfortable, it's charged, it makes me emotional, something about it. And so if something is charged, if the symbol is charged and reminds me of maybe some trauma in my childhood, I'm going to want to get far away from that because I'm afraid of that. I'm afraid of that event. I don't want to remember that event. So free association can sometimes take me farther and farther away. And Jung would always say, let's get back to the dream. Let's bring it back to the dream. Let's bring it back to the symbol when talking with someone and working on these things. So for that reason, he was not as fond of free association as Freud. He thought that another method was more important, and he called the method that he used amplification. And this is why he was interested in myths and fairy tales, etc. He would examine symbols and patterns that emerged from the unconscious of his patients, and he would look for parallel patterns that appeared in these cultural artifacts. He would search myths and fairy tales and other cultural artifacts, that is, myths and all these things, looking for similar symbols, similar patterns that he saw in the dreams and fantasies of his patients. Jung called this approach amplification or amplifying a symbol, and he privileged this much more than the technique of free association. Although, again, he would use free association selectively because it could be enlightening to the life history of the patient, etc., but he would always want to bring it back to the symbol. Now, the reason Jungians are so interested in myths, fairy tales, alchemy, religious forms, etc., is because of their great value in understanding the symbols that are generated by the unconscious. Jung was not simply interested in the exotic and esoteric in a random way. He was deliberately and specifically looking for patterns and symbols that appeared in these cultural artifacts that could help to illuminate the meaning of the symbols that arise in dreams and fantasies. Just as there was a developmental phase in human history, there are also developmental phases in human beings, and often the parallels could be seen. Developmental phase in human history would also parallel a developmental phase in a particular individual, and it can provide clues to where that person is and exactly what needed to be integrated into the person's life. So Jung was looking for parallels between the mythic symbols, that appear in culture and the symbols appearing in the dreams of his patients. The use of amplification through the study of myths, fairy tales, and alchemy will be really the main focus of the Jung 102 course. Now, this naturally begs the question, what is it that we're actually trying to achieve by looking at dreams, by doing active imagination, and by amplifying symbols? Like Jung, we're not simply curious about these things in any random or regressive way. We're not trying to move back in time to be like ancient people were. The reason we use these techniques when engaged in therapeutic work is to enable us and to empower us and our clients to be able to live an emotionally well-balanced and dynamically engaged life. When we ignore the unconscious, when we try to always compulsively direct activities in a particular way without consulting our own unconscious, without being in touch with who we are and what our deeper thoughts and feelings are about these issues, when we do that, we live under the constant threat that the unconscious will rebel and invade our conscious space, subvert our conscious intentions, and create situations where we do and say things that we soon regret. When this happens, we have fallen under the compulsion of what Jung called a complex. And these intrusions of complexes with archetypal cores from the unconscious can wreak havoc in our individual lives as well as in the broader culture, as we see all the time. But by deliberately turning and facing the unconscious and engaging with these energies consciously and directly, our hope, and often it's painful, but it's not impossible, our hope is to integrate these energies into consciousness and make use of them by making them available for life-affirming activities in the world. Now, as I've said, in addition to the personal individual benefits of this work, there are important cultural aspects to the work as well. And we'll cover many of the cultural aspects of applied Jungian psychology in our final two modules, modules 7 and 8. Ultimately, what is at stake is what we would call cultural generativity. Each of us, as mature human beings, must learn how to transform narcissism into healthy self-esteem, and with a sense of healthy self-esteem, provide generative care for our families, for our communities, for our culture, and for the planet. From the Jungian perspective, such a transformation from narcissism to generativity cannot be accomplished without learning how to regulate the instinctive energies that emerge from the unconscious. In Jungian terms, that is to say that we need to learn how to regulate archetypal energies as mature men and women. So what do I mean when I say we need to learn how to regulate archetypal energies? Well, this process of regulating archetypal energies and developing a mature, conscious relationship with the unconscious is what Jung called the process of individuation. We covered a lot about the process of individuation in Jung 101. In this course, we'll be primarily looking at how to apply those theoretical ideas that we learned in Jung 101, applying those ideas through the use of various practical methods and techniques. The goal, of course, will be to achieve and maintain a working relationship, a dialogue with the unconscious. So before we get into too many details we're just going to survey sort of the individuation process and review that, and then look a little bit more about the details that we're going to talk about in the full course. Before we do that, I want to just run through a list of different terms that we use in Jungian psychology and that you will want to be familiar with if you're not already familiar with. And some of them are common terms, but Jung understood and used them in a specific, particular way. So first term is ego. Very common term, means we could say the center of consciousness. Then, of course, the ego is in direct relationship or opposition often to the unconscious. For Jung, however, there was not just the unconscious as a random idea. He categorized the unconscious into a personal unconscious, which is the unconscious ideas, behaviors, memories, things that happened in our own lives that have, for one reason or another, fallen below the threshold of consciousness. But then he also said there's a collective unconscious, which does not refer to anything metaphysical. It refers to structures of the central nervous system, just as we all have, most of us at least, have 4 fingers and a thumb on each hand. We have a nose in the middle of the face. We have 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 legs, etc. There's a certain structure to our physical forms. The structure of the kidney may look a little different, but in everyone else, it functions in a similar way. Similarly, for Jung, the collective unconscious also has a specific structure that functions in the same way in all human beings everywhere. Now, another term that Jung coined and that he used is complexes, and complexes are essentially a network of emotions, and one of the terms he used originally was a feeling-toned complex. There's a feeling that goes with a certain memories, certain ideas, certain things that are in the unconscious. They are held together by this emotion, and at the core is an archetype. In other words, whatever the trauma or whatever it is that first initiated that complex is, there's an archetypal core. All human beings have gone through these things at some time or other, and so there's an archetypal pattern behind it. Now, complexes are not all negative. They're not all bad. There's a father complex, a mother complex. You can have a positive father complex or a negative father complex. There's the ego, Jung said, is a complex. The persona is a complex, and I'll talk about that in a second. Now, again, I'm not going to go into all the details of these. Murray Stein's book is a good place to look for definitions, and of course, Jung's own writings, and Jung 101 if you're interested in going back to that. Psychic energy, Freud called this libido, said all psychic energy was sexual. Jung said no, but he did a lot of work on the idea of the energy that moves through the psyche. Psychic does not mean like the 1-800 call the psychic. It doesn't mean clairvoyant or mystical or anything like that. It simply means of the psyche, of the central nervous system, the epiphenomena that comes from the brain and the central nervous system, and all the subjective experience of that Jung called the psyche. Now, the constituents of the personal unconscious are the complexes, and the constituents of the collective unconscious are the archetypes. Some of the archetypes are the persona, which is the face that we show to the world. Things that don't fit in the persona are repressed and fall into the shadow, which is an unconscious complex that houses, we could say, things that are unacceptable to the ego and to the persona. And again, these are thumbnail descriptions as to go through these terms because they will come up over and over again in this course. Anima and animus are contrasexual figures, just as the shadow holds unconscious things that do not fit the persona. If I'm identified with a hyper-traditional masculine role, then I'm going to have a traditional hyper-feminine anima. That's a feminine unconscious side. A woman, if she's identified with a hyper-feminine, traditional hyper-feminine role, then she will have a hyper-masculine, traditional masculine. Now, I say traditional because today gender roles are very fluid. If someone, the main thing we want to understand is that whatever we identify in terms of gender in our conscious persona roles, the anima animus is going to be a complementary opposite, complete opposite to that. It's going to be things that we feel do not fit with our persona, with our public sense of whatever our gender role is. Now, the core archetype of all archetypes is the archetype of the self. It's the organizing principle of the psyche. Again, I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about that. We have a nice little video from the Depth Psychology Alliance about an introduction to depth psychology. Talks a little more about the self if you're not familiar with that. And again, those other resources I mentioned are useful. And finally, what we've just been discussing is the process of individuation, which is the process of integrating all these things so all of this psychic energy flows smoothly and is accessible, and we can function in a way that helps us to achieve our highest life-affirming goals in life. So what I want to do now is kind of review and go through this idea of individuation, just some nuances of Jung's concept. So individuation is the word that Jung used to describe the differentiation of the conscious ego from the unconscious self. There's an early identification with the unconscious, and as we separate and become the individual we are, Jung called that process individuation. He says, the aim of individuation is nothing less than to divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images, and by that he means archetypes. To divest the self of the false wrappings of the persona on the one hand, and of the suggestive power of primordial images on the other hand. Now, we could say about individuation that there are essentially two types of individuation. One is a natural process, the other is an artificial process. In other words, Jung did not invent individuation, he simply observed some phenomena of how people develop, and he gave a name to it. That name was individuation. For Jung, individuation is essentially a natural developmental process that all living beings go through. Some organisms have adaptive processes, and some simply develop along organic lines, but they all become who and or what they are. In other words, a Buddhist would say that the dog fulfills his dog nature, and the cat her cat nature, and essentially we fulfill our nature, our Buddha nature, ultimately, hopefully, a Buddhist would say. So, for example, human beings have developed the adaptive processes of religious practices that have historically helped the natural individuation process along. As we developed, and again, I won't go into too much detail about this now, but as we developed, we became more and more dissociated from our natural processes. And so to compensate for that, we developed religious practices that keep us in touch with this deep archetypal core of the archetype of the self. So the process of religious practice and all that we would call a natural process. It developed naturally, and people did it really in a relatively unconscious way, connecting with this deep core. But an artificial process is the process that we actively, what Jung would call, actually Yolanda Jacobi called, the artificial is the process that we actively, consciously engage in through doing individual inner work or working with a therapist in individual or group settings. We call this process artificial because of the proactive involvement of consciousness with the natural, unconscious developmental processes. The problem being that over time, human beings stopped being enlivened by religious practices, and so they stopped doing those things, and the dissociation between consciousness and the unconscious became greater and greater and greater. So it's easy to try to rush this artificial process along, but much patience is required in the individuation process. The art of individuation requires the patience to wait for the unconscious to act when it is ready. Again, this is this privileging of the unconscious and allowing the unconscious to unfold in its own time and in its own way. Again, this is a thumbnail sketch of individuation. We'll talk much more. We did talk much more about it in Jung 101, and in those sources I mentioned, you'll find a lot more about it. Now, in addition to two types of individuation, there are also two essential stages to the process of individuation. The first stage is the task of the first half of life and involves the natural development of personality, social adaptation, persona, finding a mate, developing a work path, and finding one's place in society. The second stage involves integrating the shadow and learning to regulate the energies of the collective unconscious, and especially the energies of the archetype of the self. Jung focused a great deal of his work and of his energy on studying this second phase, this second stage of individuation. Much of ego psychology and the psychology that we see in mainstream therapies, non-Jungian therapies, focus largely on this first phase of life. And we'll see that Jungians are often very focused on this second phase and the phase of reconnecting with the unconscious. So it's very important, of course, to know exactly which stage of the individuation process one is working on. The tasks required for the first stage require building a strong ego and a functional relationship with the outer world. These tasks require a very different type of focus from the tasks of the second stage. The second stage has more to do with developing a relationship with the objects of the inner world. Both are involved in what we call objects. The first stage is objects in the outer world. The second phase is about objects, i.e. archetypes, the objects of the inner world and negotiating the inner world. It's also possible for someone to have work to do on both stages at the same time. Now, Jung points to the myth of the hero as a way to illustrate the tendency of the ego to descend into the unconscious during this second stage of individuation. We could call the hero's journey a myth of individuation. As the Jungian analyst Erich Neumann puts it, in the process of realizing and assimilating an unconscious content, the ego makes a descent from the conscious standpoint into the depths in order to raise up the treasure. The treasure, of course, being the psychic energy, the ability to be enlivened and be immersed in passionately in a task that one previously might have felt they just didn't have the energy to approach it. So Jung, in his book Symbols of Transformation, and then later Erich Neumann, who I just quoted in his book The Origins and History of Consciousness, and later Joseph Campbell in his book The Hero with a Thousand Faces, all of these individuals, obviously inspired by Jung, but all talk about this idea of the hero's journey, of the movement of the hero as a metaphor, essentially, for the individuation process, or for one portion, one cycle of the individuation process. As we'll see, the individuation process really involves many returns of the hero back to the underworld, going back, cycling through these phases. And this is a diagram just as one of the typical ways of viewing the hero's journey that Joseph Campbell particularly discussed. We start in the ordinary world, and then some way or other there's a call to adventure, there's a refusal of the call, or a meeting of a mentor. One way or another, one falls into the deeps, crosses the threshold, is tested, meets allies or enemies, approaches the sort of hits rock bottom, as they say in 12-step programs, and then from that point they are sort of pull themselves up and find their way out through their allies and what have you, go through an ordeal of death and rebirth, find the reward, take it back to the ordinary world, and share that boon, whatever that is, the elixir of life or the treasure or some wisdom, share that with their community, with their family, their community, with their country, with their world, and bring some, essentially, consciousness to the world. And then, as we'll see, this pattern actually repeats. Now, passing through this hero's journey is the process of differentiating. Remember, Jung said that differentiation for him is the key. And differentiation of what? Well, differentiating the ego from the deep unconscious, the unconscious self. Now, we see in these figures, the first one, the ego is completely identified with the self. Going through the hero's journey, the ego evolves and pokes up just a little bit, gets a little bit of consciousness, differentiates a little bit, cycling through that hero myth a little more. The ego pokes up a little bit more, and there's more differentiation. Now, the key and core to the individuation process is the development of what Erich Neumann called the ego-self axis. And we'll see Edward Edinger, another Jungian analyst, also used this term quite a lot in his book, Ego and Archetype. And the ego-self axis simply means the ongoing communication. Once the ego and the self are differentiated, and there's a sense of not being sort of possessed by the unconscious, one has some consciousness, but also realizes that all of the energy, all of life energy, all of the organism itself must include this energy from the unconscious. So the ego stays in touch through this connection, this axis. The ego is connected to the self, and by dialoguing with the unconscious, we maintain what they have called an ego-self axis. Now, the hero's journey, as depicted by Joseph Campbell, is what we'd call a metaphoric or mythological representation of a psychological fact. Now, this is a diagram that Edward Edinger uses to sort of illustrate this. Now, if we compare this to the hero's journey, we see that the beginning of the journey is this sense of ego self-identity, and there's a sense of inflation. Inflation simply means that one thinks one is more than one is. Why is that? Because one is identified with an archetype, and there's access to the archetypal energy, but one's unconscious of where it's coming from and thinks, oh, that's my energy, that's me. And that works a little bit, but at some point an inflated act happens. Maybe I run my car into a road, or I try to do something that I simply can't do. I stub my toe, I get divorced, I lose my job. Something happens through this state of inflation, this state of ego inflation, grandiosity, we call it in self-psychology. Through that state, something happens where we experience rejection, we experience an alienation from all those energies we previously had been identified with. Suddenly we're alienated from them. We have no access to this energy. We feel terrible. We go through a period of wounding, dismemberment, until we reach the very rock bottom, and we experience then a sacrificial attitude, a sense of humility. We realize that this energy is available to us, but it's not me. It's energy that I have access to if I'm humble and if I learn how to steward this energy. When I accept this fact, I can reconnect with who I once was, and I can bring, again, this energy back up to the world where I can serve my families and my community and my world. And as I do that, I begin to get a sense of who I am, but then I'm in the danger, of course, of getting into that inflated state again. And we cycle back and forth through this and through this until we develop the skill of recognizing that if I stay in contact with the unconscious, if I develop this ego self-axis, then I will be safe, and I will recognize that it's not me, it's not my energy, but it's energy I have access to and that I can steward if I'm humble and have some humility about it. So the ongoing danger that we face when we do not learn how to manage our complexes, when we do not learn how to dialogue with the archetypes of the unconscious, the danger is twofold. We risk either falling prey to identification with the archetypal energies, which causes us to be inflated or to become ego-driven, or the other side, and when you look at those of you who do work in counseling, If you're familiar with the diagnostical and statistical manual, identification with archetypal energies is parallel to the anxiety disorders or the manic disorders. Whereas when we're on the bottom side and we feel alienated from those archetypal energies, we have no access to the energies, this is the depressive pole. This is the area where we have no energy and we just can't get out of bed, we can't do anything because we just have no access to those energies. However, dialoguing with and remaining in communication with the unconscious can help us to learn how to regulate and steward these powerful archetypal energies. If we do not learn how to do so, we may become identified with the energies and be inflated, think we are in control of them when we're not, or when we fail to be in control of them, we may become alienated from our own life energies and fall into a deep depression. So it's this cycling back and forth through over and over. By doing that, if we can do that without killing ourselves or becoming alcoholics or becoming addictive in some way or ruining our lives, if we can do that and learn the skill to develop this ego-self axis, then we can differentiate the ego more and more, maintain that connection, and we will have access to these energies. And we do this by developing a relationship with the archetypes, a respect for the archetypes. In ancient times, we would pray to the archetypes. We would have a religious practice where we recognized that we were at the mercy of the gods, always at the mercy of the gods. Well, we're still at the mercy of the gods without getting into any metaphysics about what is in the realm beyond the psyche, but simply in terms of the psyche, we still need to be respectful of the archetypes of the collective unconscious, however we may experience them. So, as you can see, we've just really kind of flitted over the top of some of these basic ideas, sort of the basics of Jung's theory and the basics of how we would apply that theory. Now, what I want to do is go into some details about what we're going to cover in the course, how we tease out the specifics of applying Jung's theory in different ways, including working with dreams and active imagination, all that. And I'll do that by reviewing the different modules and the topics that we cover in Jung 102. But before we do that, I want to just say a little bit about the course textbook. So whether you're planning to take Jung 102 or not, whether you're planning to take it in order to earn the course certificate or you simply want to audit the course, any three of those categories, in any case, you'll really benefit from reading the course textbook, which is the book Inner Work, Using Dreams and Active Imagination for Personal Growth. It's written by Jungian analyst Robert Johnson. It's not as technical as our textbook for Jung 101. We'll get into a lot of technical things in the course, but he uses very conversational language, very easy to read, wonderful writer, but he's absolutely from the Jungian perspective. He is a Jungian analyst. He's written wonderful books. He, she, and we, you may have read by him. If not, I recommend them. They're wonderful. But his book, Inner Work, outlines a lot of the kinds of things that we're going to be talking about in this course, although we're going to be referring more to Jung's work. We will also refer to his book throughout. As the title suggests, Inner Work is a book focused on different approaches to doing what Jung called inner work, and that's what this course is about. And that means maintaining this dialogue that we've been talking about with the unconscious. He approaches individual communication with the unconscious through a Jungian lens, and although we will not follow his text as closely as we followed the textbook in Jung 101, we will refer to it throughout, and I think it will help to pad out the course. And again, even if you're not thinking of taking the course, wonderful book to learn more about this idea of applying Jungian psychology. So the course is 8 modules, 9 counting this introductory module. The first module is called Sacred Space, Symbols, Patterns, and Amplification. And in this first module, we'll look at the main constituents of Jungian work. First, there must be a place reserved for the work to take place, as we've already talked about. Not necessarily a physical location, but a time and a commitment to making sure that the work is going on a regular basis, creating a container. Essential to the work that takes place in this space is an understanding of the nature of symbolic work and of the patterns that emerge from the study of the symbols produced by the unconscious. As we've said, the key technique is understanding the symbols, and a way of doing that is through amplification. And amplification is about understanding myths, fairy tales, alchemy, etc., and we'll go into great detail with those in the other modules of this course. Now, another important idea that we'll touch on in this first module is the idea of compensation. That's part of Jung's theory, which we talked about in Jung 101. But essential to Jung's method is the understanding that the unconscious will compensate the conscious attitude in an attempt to bring the psychic system into balance. And there's a lot more to say about that, but that will be in that first module. Now, in module 2, we'll focus on one of the real central methods that Jung used, and that is dream work. Once we've established some key parameters in module 1, in module 2 we're going to look at Jung's own approach to dream work. As is common in most approaches to depth psychology, Jung felt that dreams were a direct expression of the unconscious psychic activity that we experience, and as such, dreams can provide important clues as to what unconscious factors may be seeking expression in our lives, need to be integrated. And this is a great way to begin developing this ego-self axis. So in this module, we'll look at the specifics of Jung's techniques of dream analysis, and we'll also look at techniques and approaches used by and developed by later Jungians and later dream workers. So module 3, we will look at Jung's second, and in many ways his most innovative and certainly something that he valued intensely, which is active imagination. It's another approach to working with the unconscious. And many of you may be familiar with Jung's Red Book. Well, his Red Book was a product of this technique that he used of active imagination. So now, whereas in dream work, we are more or less passively allowing the unconscious to communicate with us through dreams, in active imagination, the word active is the key word, and in active imagination we actively, consciously, and deliberately enter into dialogue with the images and symbols that have arisen from the unconscious. We can work with images that arise from a dream that we don't understand, or we can just simply, as Jung often did, just close our eyes, sink into a state, or do various activities that will prompt the unconscious. And when we see an image, hear a sound, make a movement, whatever type of active imagination process we're using, we then work with that image, ask questions of the image, listen for a response, and develop a dialogue in that way. And this is another very, very valuable way to begin to work with and develop and maintain this ego self-axis. So in this module, we're going to go into a lot of detail about that technique of Jung's. So having established Jung's two primary methods, dreams and active imagination, looked at those in detail, then we are going to spend 3 modules looking at 3 specific areas that Jung studied intensively in order to develop a sort of a lexicon, an understanding, a catalog of patterns of myth, images, symbols, and how they worked in human psyche throughout history. And by understanding those things, he was able to better understand the dreams and the active imagination symbols that arose. So the first one we're going to look at in Module 4 is working with mythology. Now, of course, there's much to say about Jungian myth, and we'll only get to some of it in Module 4. But the aspect of myth that is essential for applied Jungian psychology is the use of myth for the amplification of dream images and the figures encountered in active imagination. In this context, we'll look for parallel images and symbols that seem to correspond to the images and symbols that arise in the psyche while doing inner work. Additionally, however, one must still have some understanding of the meaning of the myth if we are to extrapolate from the myth the meaning of the dream image. So for that reason, the more we know about myths, the more we know about interpreting myths, understanding myths, and of course all these other cultural artifacts, the better we're going to be able to apply them to the dreams. Jung has said that myths are original revelations from the pre-conscious psyche, involuntary statements about unconscious psychic happenings. And because they're common to everyone throughout history, to one degree or another, they're very, very valuable in understanding typical phases of human life that everyone goes through. As such, the meaning of a myth must be understood within the context of the group within which it first appeared. So although it's meaningful for everyone, the actual meaning of a myth, I may hear a myth and think something specific about it, but when we look at the myth in the context of the people and the group within which it arose, we have a better sense of that. Likewise, we will want to understand the symbols that arise from dreams and active imagination in the context of the life of the person we're talking about. And there's many, many nuances to all of that, and those are the kind of things we'll be exploring in Module 4. Now, Module 5, we could easily say that fairy tales are a subdivision of myth, or really all of these other things could fall under that, whether we're talking about alchemy or fairy tales or talking about religious, world religions and other religious practices. We could put them all under the heading of myth, but we break them down because each is a very, very rich category. So Module 5 will be about working with fairy tales. And like myths, fairy tales provide an enormous amount of material for amplification. And there's a difference, though, between cultural mythologies and fairy tales. And the expert on Jungian understandings of fairy tales, many of you may know, is the great and wonderful analyst Marie-Louise von Franz. And I want to read a quote to you from her of what she heard from Dr. Jung. She says, Dr. Jung once said that it is in fairy tales that one can best study the comparative anatomy of the psyche. In myths or legends or any other more elaborate mythological material, we get at the basic patterns of the human psyche through a lot of cultural material. But in fairy tales, there is much less specific cultural conscious material, and therefore they mirror the basic patterns of the psyche more clearly. End of quote. And what she means by that is, and what Jung means by that is that myths tend to be part of a body of a religious canon or a body of a cultural canon of some type in which many, many people have rewritten them, they've repeated them through an oral tradition, and they begin to take on it each time they're told, each time they're written down. They're changed a little bit, they're redacted a little bit, and they fit and apply to more and more and more and more people, whereas with fairy tales, they are told by one person to a small group, traditionally, the old, very old fairy tales, which we often look for the oldest ones we can find. And because of this, and because they are so evocative and so ethereal, they, as she says, they get right to the core, to the anatomy, to the sort of bare bones of the collective unconscious. So they're very powerful. Reading a lot, if you ever read a lot of the really old fairy tales, they can be quite, they definitely will help to stimulate your dreams because they're very evocative of these archetypal patterns. So myths can be helpful in understanding broad cultural patterns. For example, I'm of primarily Scots-Irish heritage. Scottish and Irish mythologies are very helpful to me in understanding my own family dynamics and patterns. Personal history can often be seen parallels to that in the histories of a particular ethnic group. Same mythologies might not have the same resonance for someone of a Jewish or a Nordic or Germanic background. They might resonate more with myths from those cultures. Fairy tales, on the other hand, although they are adapted by different cultures, usually have not been passed through a cultural filter in the same way and are not modified over time in the same way to fit the broad public of a given culture in the same way that cultural myths have done. Fairy tales can often tell us more about the basic human structures of the psyche that transcend cultural differences than any myth can. So in this module, we'll discuss a number of different ways that fairy tales can be applied to Jungian work. And that's Module 5. Module 6, we'll look at one of the really, this is, if anything, rivals fairy tales in being evocative and really fascinating, and really one of the reasons Jung was so into alchemy is because it parallels our very scientifically oriented Western mind, and it's right at that liminal borderline place between mythology and scientific thinking. And it's a fascinating area. Well, we won't obviously touch on everything in alchemy. We have a whole course on alchemy, but Module 6 will be about the parallels between alchemical processes and the individuation process. So with this module, we'll enter into Jung's most important discovery, many would say, he certainly felt so, that the fantasies of the early alchemists were actually a myth of individuation for the modern world. Not only that, the myths and symbols of alchemy incorporate and integrate all of the major mythologies of the Western world: astrology, fairy tales, the Holy Grail. There's biblical imagery, both Hebrew Bible, Old Testament imagery, as well as New Testament type imagery. There's metallurgy, there's myths of the earth and of the chemical elements from which all matter is constructed, and much more. It's just a mishmash. It's just a fascinating collection of images and ideas and ways of encountering the physical world while still thinking in this we could say pre-modern mythological way. So all of these ideas were brought together in alchemy. Furthermore, alchemy is not simply a system of static images and symbols. The whole point of alchemy is defining and describing a process of creating something. The myths of alchemy describe a dynamic movement of energy that mirrors the activity of the psyche in the individuation process, because in the individuation process, we're also trying to create something. We're trying to create a healthy, dynamic, well-balanced, dynamic life that we can live in an affirmative, generative way. So understanding the imagery of alchemy can be enormously useful in understanding the imagery generated by the unconscious, particularly in Western people. This is why Jung focused on energy, was because he felt that it was corresponded much more to the dreams of his clients, who were European people primarily, and so he focused on that rather than, he had a great interest in Eastern religion and Eastern thought, but he found that those myths did not parallel his the experiences of his clients in the Western world as well as alchemy did. So in Module 6, we'll touch on many of the exciting aspects of alchemy and how they can be applied to Jungian work. Module 7, we're going to begin our 2-module journey through understanding culture through a Jungian lens. And with Module 7, we'll begin to look at some of the ways that we can use Jungian theory to understand culture. Jung was intensely interested in applying his theory to understanding culture, especially Western culture, and especially understanding the institutions of Christianity. My own interest in this area is in understanding how the lack of masculine initiation processes in our culture has led to a world of uninitiated boys running the world. We'll discuss all these things, including gender and other issues, in this module. And finally, in Module 8, I'm going to talk about culture in a broad spiritual sense, talking about ancestry, spiritual practice, and ritual eldership, and how these ideas of process, of dream, active imagination work, and amplification can all be applied to understanding this. We'll look at how individuals can move towards becoming stewards of the archetypal energies that we've been learning to process and to regulate and to work with. And in the end, the task of the hero or the heroine is to bring back to the community the treasures that we have retrieved in the underworld. If we are simply, as some people would say, navel gazers and not bringing something to bear into the real world, we're not really doing Jungian work. Even if we're an introvert, our goal is to become, to balance introversion and extroversion. We'll talk about that a little bit as well. So in this final module, we'll look at the role of ancestry, spiritual practice, and ritual eldership in all of the integration of these energies. So that is a complete introduction to and overview of Jung 102, Applied Jungian Psychology. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to Applied Jungian Psychology. There's much, much more to learn about the application of Carl Jung's innovative theory. And if you're ready to learn more, we hope that you will take the opportunity to sign up now for the full Jung 102 Applied Jungian Psychology course. Thanks for spending this time with me.